Welcome to the new episode of History of Revolution. How are you? Hope your week was fine. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into an absolutely critical moment in modern world history, the German Revolution of 1918-1919.
Yeah, absolutely critical. This is really the great test case for world socialism, happening right on the heels of the Bolshevik victory in Russia.
Right, because Russia was largely agrarian, kind of seen as backward industrially speaking.
Exactly, but Germany was the powerhouse, the industrial heart of Europe. It had the biggest, strongest, most organized working class movement anywhere in the world at that time. If socialism was going to take root and spread globally, well, everyone expected it to happen there.
So that's our mission today for you listening. We want to cut through what can seem like a really complex period, lots of factions, events happening super fast to get a clear picture. What actually happened? Why did this revolution in industrial Germany ultimately fail? And maybe most importantly, what did that failure mean for the decades that followed? We're really digging into the roots of later disasters here.
And to frame just how high the stakes were, we really need to start with Rosa Luxemburg. She was one of the key leaders, a brilliant theorist, and she posed that famous stark choice: socialism or barbarism.
Socialism or barbarism?
Yes, and the events we're about to unpack really show how close Europe actually came to socialism, and how the failure to achieve it led, tragically, almost inevitably you could argue, towards barbarism.
Okay, so to understand why Germany exploded in revolution in 1918, we have to step back and look at the nightmare that came before it, World War I.
The Great Slaughter, as Alan Woods calls it. And it's crucial to understand this wasn't just some tragic accident. From a Marxist perspective, this was an imperialist conflict, pure and simple.
What does that mean exactly? Imperialist conflict.
It means it was a war driven by the inherent logic of advanced capitalism. These major powers, Germany, Britain, France, they were locked in this desperate competition for colonies, for global markets, for resources, spheres of influence, basically for profit and expansion. It wasn't about democracy or defending the nation. That was just the propaganda.
Propaganda that cost millions of lives.
Millions, primarily working-class lives, sacrificed in the trenches for the ambitions of their ruling classes. Huge parts of Europe were devastated. And inside Germany itself, the situation was dire. Especially for the urban working class and poor, severe food shortages, people were starving, malnutrition was rampant, basic services collapsing.
And this suffering, this waste, it fuels anger, right? It starts to build revolutionary consciousness.
Absolutely. People start asking, why are we fighting? Who benefits? And that anger gets magnified by a profound sense of betrayal. Betrayal by the very organizations that were supposed to represent the working class.
Which brings us squarely to the collapse of the Second International. This feels like a really pivotal moment. Can you explain what the Second International actually was?
It was huge. Think of it as the United Nations of socialist parties. It brought together all the major mass workers' parties from across the industrialized world. Its founding principle, repeated over and over again at congresses, was international solidarity.
Solidarity against war, specifically.
Yes, a solemn promise. If the capitalist governments went to war, the international working class would respond with strikes, with mass action, potentially even revolution to stop it. And the absolute cornerstone of this international was the German Social Democratic Party, the SPD. Everyone looked to the SPD. It was massive, highly organized, seen as the model socialist party.
But then, August 4th, 1914, the war starts. What happens in the German parliament, the Reichstag?
Betrayal. Plain and simple. The SPD parliamentary group, the elected deputies, voted for war credits. They voted to fund the Kaiser's war machine.
Wow, so they just abandoned everything they supposedly stood for?
In that moment, yes.
Yeah.
The leadership chose nationalism over internationalism. They sided with their ruling class against the workers of France, Britain, Russia. It was a catastrophic failure, a shattering blow to the idea of international proletarian solidarity. It essentially gave the green light to the imperialist slaughter.
How could that happen? Decades of anti-militarist rhetoric, and then this? Was it just panic or something?
It was deeper. It was the result of a long, slow drift towards what Marxists call opportunism. This was tied to the rise of revisionism, particularly associated with Edward Bernstein.
Revisionism, meaning revising Marx.
Essentially, yes. Bernstein and others argued that capitalism wasn't inevitably heading for collapse. They believed it could be gradually reformed, piece by piece, into socialism through parliamentary action, through trade union negotiations, winning elections, getting small improvements. That became the focus.
So the revolutionary goal sort of faded.
It faded for a significant part of the party and union bureaucracy. They became invested in the system. They had salaries, positions, union funds, political careers within the existing state. So when the crisis hit in 1914, this bureaucracy, which controlled the party apparatus, faced a choice: risk everything in a revolutionary struggle against the war, or protect their position by going along with the state. They chose the state. Rosa Luxemburg saw this coming. She attacked this revisionism relentlessly for years.
And this vote for war credits, it allowed the German government to impose something called Burgfrieden, fortress peace.
Right. Burgfrieden was basically a political truce for the duration of the war. It meant suspending the class struggle. No strikes, no wage demands, no protests. Everyone had to unite behind the war effort. And crucially, the leaders of the powerful German trade unions signed up to this too.
So the workers' own organizations helped enforce discipline for the war machine.
Effectively, yes. The state could then focus on the external enemy because the enemy within the organized working class had been temporarily neutralized by its own leadership, all under this banner of national unity.
But not everyone went along with it. You mentioned Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht.
Absolutely crucial figures. Liebknecht was initially the only SPD deputy to vote against the war credits in a later vote. Imagine the pressure, the courage that took. He stood completely alone at first.
And Luxemburg.
Luxemburg was the theoretical powerhouse of the anti-war left. She argued forcefully that this betrayal wasn't an accident, but the logical outcome of the party's drift towards opportunism, towards integration into the capitalist system.
And their opposition eventually formed a group.
Yes. They started as the Group Internationale, writing illegal leaflets and organizing dissent. This group eventually became much better known as the Spartacist League, the Spartacist Bund.
Spartacus, like the Roman slave rebel.
Exactly. Their aim wasn't just to protest the war, but to use the crisis more. The war created the suffering, the economic collapse, the political instability to overthrow the capitalist system itself, to turn the imperialist war into a civil war for socialism, which was actually the official policy agreed upon by the Second International before it collapsed.
Okay, so fast forward 4 years. Late 1918, Germany is losing the war, the military is collapsing, the home front is starving. The conditions seem, well, explosive.
Utterly explosive. Our sources talk about the situation being ripe for a proletarian takeover.
Yeah.
The sheer exhaustion and misery from the war were overwhelming. Plus, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia the year before had shown it was possible. Workers and soldiers could actually overthrow the old order. It was a massive inspiration.
So the revolution wasn't meticulously planned by the Spartacists.
No, not at all. It erupted spontaneously from the bottom up. Driven by defeat and desperation, you had mass strikes breaking out, mutinies in the army. It was a genuine tidal wave.
And the spark that lit the fuse came from the Navy, right? The sailors in Kiel.
Yes, the Kiel Mutiny in early November 1918. It was the catalyst. The German High Command, completely detached from reality, ordered the fleet out for one last suicidal honor battle against the British Navy.
A death ride, basically.
Absolutely. And the sailors, who were mostly working-class guys forced into service, just said no. We're not dying for nothing. Their refusal instantly spread like wildfire. Strikes, riots, sailors and workers forming revolutionary committees, councils, first in Kiel, then across northern Germany.
And this movement just swept away the old regime.
Incredibly quickly. Within days, the German Empire basically ceased to exist. The Kaiser, Wilhelm II, was forced to abdicate. All the various kings and princes of the German states were gone too. The military high command, the old ruling class, they suddenly realized they'd lost control completely. Their only thought now was damage control.
So they try a revolution from above.
Exactly. The elites, people like Paul von Hintz, realized they couldn't stop the revolution, so they tried to manage it, to channel it into safe pathways. They made some constitutional changes, appointed a new chancellor, Prince Max von Baden. But it was too little, too late. The momentum was with the streets.
And Prince Max makes a crucial decision. He hands power over to Friedrich Ebert, the leader of the SPD.
Yes, because the elites figured the SPD leadership was the only force that could potentially control the masses, could prevent a full-blown socialist revolution like in Russia.
And Ebert's reaction is incredibly revealing. There's that quote.
It tells you everything. He said to Prince Max something like, "If the Kaiser doesn't abdicate, social revolution is unavoidable. But I do not want it. No, I hate it like sin."
He hated social revolution, the leader of the Social Democratic Party.
He saw his job as preventing it. He wanted a parliamentary democracy, order, stability within the existing state structure, maybe with some reforms. He fundamentally feared the revolutionary energy from below.
And this fundamental conflict revolution from below versus managed transition from above, it comes to a head dramatically on one day. November 9th, 1918, in Berlin. The dual republics.
That's right. It was chaos in Berlin. Huge crowds on the streets. Philipp Scheidemann, another top SPD leader, got worried the radicals were about to declare a Soviet republic. So he rushed to a balcony of the Reichstag building and, almost in panic, proclaimed the German Republic, a parliamentary republic.
Trying to get ahead of the curve.
Exactly. But just about 2 hours later, Karl Liebknecht, the Spartacist leader, stood on a balcony of the old royal palace and proclaimed the German Socialist Republic.
So two competing visions declared almost simultaneously.
Precisely. Bourgeois democracy versus workers' power. Parliament versus councils. That was the central conflict right there, laid bare on November 9th.
And speaking of councils, these workers' and soldiers' councils, the Soviets, they were springing up everywhere.
Everywhere. Directly elected in factories, in army barracks, in offices. They were incredibly democratic, very flexible, a direct expression of power from the ground up, inspired by the Russian example.
This created a situation of dual power, didn't it? You had the official government forming under Ebert, but alongside it, these councils held real authority.
For a crucial period, yes. In those chaotic first weeks, as some sources point out, effectively nothing happened without the approval of the local Workers' and Soldiers' Council. The old state authority had collapsed. The workers and soldiers had filled the vacuum. The whole question was, which power would win out? The formal government led by the SPD or the revolutionary councils?
So, as we said, Ebert and the SPD leadership, their goal wasn't to push the revolution forward. According to analysis by people like Ben Lewis, they saw the revolution as basically done. Kaiser's gone, war's ending, now let's get back to order.
Establish a nice, orderly parliamentary republic. Exactly. Their mission was to stop the revolution from going too far, from becoming socialist. They saw themselves as caretakers, holding the fort until they could hold elections for a national assembly.
But to maintain order against the revolutionary workers and soldiers, they needed muscle, they needed force.
And this is where they made their most fateful decision. The decision that really sealed the fate of the revolution, you could argue. The Ebert-Groener Pact.
The pact with the military.
Yes. On November 10th, the day after the dual republics were declared, Ebert got a secret phone call from General Wilhelm Groener, who was basically running the Army High Command at that point.
The same high command that had just led Germany into catastrophic defeat.
The very same. And Groener offered Ebert a deal. The Army would support Ebert's government, would remain loyal.
Okay. But what did the Army want in return? There had to be a catch.
Oh, a huge catch. The Army's loyalty came on two conditions. First, Ebert's government had to resist Bolshevism, fight against the radical left. Second, and critically, the authority of the existing officer corps. The same aristocratic, deeply anti-socialist, monarchist officers who ran the Kaiser's army had to be maintained. Their power structure, their discipline, couldn't be challenged.
Wait, so the SPD government agreed to protect the old imperial officer corps, the very people who hated everything the SPD supposedly stood for.
They did. It was an explicit agreement to crush the revolutionary potential within the army itself, particularly the soldiers' councils, and to preserve the backbone of the old imperial state. Ebert saw the army as the only reliable tool to prevent chaos and stop a socialist revolution. He chose the generals over the workers' council.
That's staggering. It's basically an alliance between the reformist socialist leadership and the heart of the old militarist capitalist state.
That's precisely what it was, a pact against the revolution. It ensured the survival of the counter-revolutionary forces within the state apparatus.
Now, to make this look a bit better, the SPD formed a provisional government called the Council of People's Commissars. And they included ministers from the USPD, right, the Independent Social Democrats.
Yes, the USPD was the party that had split from the SPD during the war, precisely because they opposed the SPD's pro-war stance. They were further to the left, closer to the councils. Including them gave the Ebert government a kind of left cover.
Made it look more unified, more revolutionary than it was.
Exactly. But in practice, the real power stayed with Ebert and the SPD majority, who were busy marginalizing the actual organs of workers' power. That central executive council of the workers' and soldiers' councils in Berlin, the Volksratsrat, they basically sidelined it, turned it into a talking shop with no real teeth.
And what about the rest of the state? The judges, the civil servants?
Left completely untouched. The entire imperial bureaucracy remained in place, staffed by the same conservative, anti-republican officials. So you had this bizarre situation. A government led by socialists, supposedly, but administered day-to-day by people loyal to the old regime.
And this commitment to the old structures, it extended to the economy too. What about calls for socialization, for taking over industries?
Paid lip service mostly. They set up a socialization commission, but it was pure window dressing. It achieved absolutely nothing. The SPD line was basically, we can't possibly socialize anything now. We need stability first. We need to rebuild the economy. Which of course meant protecting private property and the interests of the capitalist class.
They even kept German troops fighting in the Baltics, didn't they, against the Russian Revolution?
Yes, which shows their tacit support for imperialism continued. They were more interested in containing Bolshevism than in fundamentally changing the system.
This puts the USPD, the independent socialists who joined the government, in a really awkward spot. They were anti-war, they were more radical, yet they were sitting at the table with Ebert while all this was happening.
It was a deeply contradictory position. They were suspicious of Ebert, they knew about the deal with Groner, but they seemed to believe they could act as a brake, maybe push the government leftwards from the inside, or perhaps they just felt they had to join to maintain some semblance of unity on the left.
Hey, listener, do you have any other idea or question about this? Please write in comments. It's a really interesting strategic dilemma, isn't it? Joining a government you fundamentally disagree with, hoping to influence it, versus staying outside and potentially having less immediate impact but maintaining your principles. What do you think the USPD should have done?
Well, whatever their intentions, their position became untenable. The breaking point was the Christmas crisis of 1918.
What happened then?
Ebert and the SPD leadership ordered regular army troops, troops loyal to the government and the old command structure, to attack the People's Naval Division. This was a group of several thousand revolutionary sailors who had come to Berlin and were occupying the Royal Palace, a real bastion of the revolution.
So the SPD government used the army against revolutionary sailors.
Yes. There were bloody clashes right in the center of Berlin around Christmas. It was a clear signal. The SPD was willing to use deadly force against the left wing of the revolution.
And the USPD ministers?
They couldn't stomach it. They resigned in protest on December 29th. They called it a betrayal, a bloodbath.
So that left the SPD alone in government.
Yes. And now it was crystal clear. The SPD was solely responsible for the government, and that government was openly pursuing a counter-revolutionary course, hand in glove with the military high command. The gloves were off.
Okay, so the USPD is out of the government. The SPD is clearly allied with the military against the revolution. What does this mean for the Spartacists, for Luxemburg and Liebknecht?
It meant they could no longer stay within the USPD, which they had rejoined temporarily after their initial split. The lines were drawn too clearly now. So at the very end of December 1918, beginning of January 1919, they held a Congress and formally founded the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD.
A dedicated revolutionary party like the Bolsheviks.
That was the intention. But, and this is crucial, the KPD was fundamentally different from the Bolsheviks at that point. As sources like Marie Fredrickson point out, it was incredibly new, very small, and lacked deep roots among the broader working class outside of a few radical centers like Berlin.
And lacked experience, discipline.
Critically, yes. It was made up largely of very brave, very militant, but often very young and inexperienced revolutionaries. And it was plagued by what Lenin would call ultra-leftism, a kind of revolutionary impatience, a tendency towards adventurism.
And this ultra-leftism led to a major strategic blunder right at the KPD's founding Congress, didn't it, regarding the upcoming elections?
A huge blunder. Elections were called for a National Assembly for mid-January to write a new constitution for the Republic. Rosa Luxemburg, Paul Levy, and other leaders argued passionately that the KPD had to participate in these elections.
Why? If they wanted revolution, why engage in parliamentary elections?
Because they understood that millions of ordinary German workers, including women who could vote for the first time, still believed in the parliamentary process. They saw the National Assembly as the legitimate path forward. Boycotting the election would mean isolating the KPD from these masses, cutting themselves off from the very people they needed to win over.
But the majority of the delegates at the Congress disagreed.
They did. Overwhelmed by revolutionary fervor, perhaps, they voted against participation. They saw Parliament as a bourgeois sham, obsolete. They wanted immediate revolutionary action, not electioneering.
How badly did this isolate them?
Fatally, arguably. When the elections were held a few weeks later, the turnout was massive, something like 83%. It showed the masses were still invested in that process. The KPD, by boycotting, essentially made itself irrelevant to that huge democratic expression and confined its influence largely to the already radicalized workers, mainly in Berlin. It was a serious misreading of the popular mood.
So the KPD is newly formed, inexperienced, and has just isolated itself politically. And then comes the spark for the next explosion, January 1919.
Yes. The SPD government, feeling more confident now perhaps, made a deliberately provocative move. On January 4th, they fired the police chief of Berlin, Emil Eichhorn.
Why was he significant?
Eichhorn was a member of the USPD, the Independent Socialists. He was popular with the workers and was seen as sympathetic to the revolution, refusing to use his police force against striking workers previously. Firing him was seen by the entire left, USPD, revolutionary shop stewards, KPD as a direct attack, an attempt to purge radicals from positions of authority in the capital.
And the reaction?
Immediate and enormous. The next day, hundreds of thousands of workers spontaneously poured into the streets of Berlin to protest Eichhorn's dismissal. It was one of the biggest demonstrations Berlin had ever seen.
But was this demonstration a signal that the masses were ready for an armed uprising, for a seizure of power?
This is where it gets tragic. The experienced KPD leadership, Luxemburg, Leo Jogiches, Paul Levi, they understood it wasn't. They knew the movement in Berlin was strong, but the provinces weren't ready. As Marie Fredrickson notes, they felt the first wave of the revolution was actually receding, and that a strategic retreat and more organization were needed.
But that's not what happened.
No. Again, that ultra-left impatience took over. Karl Liebknecht, who was immensely popular but perhaps more an agitator than a strategist, got swept up in the energy of the mass demonstration. Along with Wilhelm Pieck from the KPD and representatives from the USPD and the revolutionary shop stewards, he helped form a revolutionary committee on the spot.
And this committee decided?
They decided impulsively to try and overthrow the Ebert government, right then and there. They called for a general strike and began occupying newspaper offices and some public buildings. Crucially, this was done against the advice and the will of the official KPD leadership like Luxemburg.
So a spontaneous, ill-prepared putsch attempt led by a committee formed on the fly without the backing of the party leadership or a clear plan.
Exactly. It was adventurism. Luxemburg was reportedly furious and dismayed. There's a story, maybe apocryphal, of her confronting Liebknecht and asking, "Is that our program, Karl?" She knew it was a disastrous mistake, playing right into the hands of the counter-revolution.
And the government's response.
Swift and utterly brutal. Gustav Noske, the SPD Minister of Defense, the same guy who had earlier said someone had to be the bloodhound, took charge.
By the way, if you liked and interested so far, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. It's really important for us to continue this series.
Noske didn't rely on the regular army, which was somewhat unreliable and partially sympathetic to the workers. Instead, he unleashed the Free Corps.
These are the groups we mentioned earlier, paramilitary units.
Yes. These were newly formed volunteer units, often made up of former elite soldiers, officers, students, guys who were fiercely nationalist, anti-communist, anti-Semitic, anti-Republican. They were essentially proto-fascist shock troops, armed and sanctioned by the SPD government.
So the Social Democratic government used proto-fascist militias to crush a workers' uprising.
That is the brutal reality. The so-called Spartacist Uprising, which was really more of a poorly organized general strike and occupation movement, was crushed within about a week by the Freikorps, using machine guns, mortars, grenades. It was incredibly violent street fighting.
And after the fighting stopped,
A reign of terror began. The Freikorps hunted down revolutionaries, and the ultimate prize for them was capturing the leaders. On January 15, 1919, both Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were captured by Freikorps soldiers.
and murdered.
Brutally murdered. They were beaten, tortured, and then shot. Luxemburg's body was dumped in a canal. Liebknecht's was delivered to a morgue as an unknown man. It was political assassination, pure and simple, carried out by forces operating with the implicit, if not explicit, protection of the SPD government under Gustav Noske. The subsequent trials for the murderers were a farce, with ridiculously light sentences. The head of the German Revolution had been cut off.
So we've walked through the timeline, the betrayals, the uprising, the tragic end for Luxemburg and Liebknecht. Let's circle back to the big question. Why did it fail? Why Germany, the place with the strongest workers' movement, the place everyone looked to?
From a Marxist standpoint, the analysis points to two main interconnected reasons. First, as we discussed, the subjective factor, the revolutionary leadership.
The KPD being too young, too inexperienced.
Exactly. Unlike the Bolsheviks, who had spent years building a disciplined, centralized party, forging deep links with the masses, and testing their leadership through multiple struggles, the KPD was thrown together in the heat of the moment. It lacked that maturity, that strategic clarity, that connection to the broader working class beyond the most radicalized sections. It was prone to errors, like the election boycott and the disastrous January uprising.
But it wasn't just the KPD's weakness, was it? The actions of the SPD were decisive.
Absolutely decisive. That's the second key factor. The conscious, deliberate counter-revolutionary role played by the SPD leadership. They didn't just fail to lead the revolution, they actively worked to crush it.
Through the Ebert-Groener Pact, through protecting the old state, through unleashing the Freikorps.
Precisely. They made a strategic choice to ally themselves with the forces of the old order, the military high command, the bureaucracy against the revolutionary workers and soldiers. They used the state power they inherited not to build socialism, but to defend capitalism and the bourgeois state, even using extreme violence to do so.
And this failure in Germany, it wasn't just a German tragedy. It had huge international repercussions, didn't it? Especially for Russia.
Immense repercussions. The Bolsheviks, Lenin and Trotsky, had always banked on the German Revolution succeeding. They saw Soviet Russia as a besieged fortress that could only survive long-term if the revolution spread to the industrialized West, especially Germany.
Germany could provide the economic and industrial aid Russia desperately needed. Yes, and political reinforcement. When the German Revolution failed, the Russian Revolution was left isolated, surrounded by hostile capitalist powers, economically backward, devastated by civil war. This isolation created the conditions for the rise of bureaucracy within Russia, the exhaustion of the working class, and ultimately the consolidation of Stalin's totalitarian regime. The failure in Germany helped pave the way for Stalinism.
Wow, so the failure here directly contributed to the degeneration of the revolution there.
That's a core part of the analysis, yes. And the consequences within Germany itself were equally catastrophic, leading directly to the other great horror of the 20th century.
Fascism, Nazism.
Exactly. Remember Luxemburg's choice, socialism or barbarism. Germany failed to achieve socialism in 1919. What followed eventually was barbarism.
How direct is that link between the SPD crushing the revolution in 1919 and Hitler coming to power in 1933? The link is chillingly direct. By using the Freikorps, these violent, anti-democratic, proto-fascist militias to suppress the left, the SPD government legitimized political violence from the extreme right. They gave these forces state sanction and protection.
They armed their future gravediggers, essentially.
In a very real sense, yes. They also decapitated the revolutionary working class movement by murdering its most capable leaders, Luxemburg and Liebknecht. This left the German working class politically disoriented and divided in the face of the rising Nazi threat later on.
And the Weimar Republic, the democracy the SPD supposedly saved.
It was fatally weakened from the start. The SPD's actions alienated huge sections of the working class who saw the party as betrayers who had sided with the generals. At the same time, the old elites, the army, the industrialists, the judiciary never truly accepted the republic anyway, so it lacked firm support from both the left and the right. It was inherently unstable.
So the SPD's choice in 1919, choosing order and the state over revolution.
It ultimately guaranteed the worst kind of disorder. They preserved the capitalist state, but in doing so, they created the conditions for the Weimar Republic's collapse and the rise of the Nazis. They prevented socialism, but they inadvertently paved the road to Auschwitz. That's the devastating lesson.
It really underscores the immense responsibility of leadership in revolutionary moments. The choices made, the principles upheld or betrayed, they can shape history for generations.
Absolutely. The SPD thought they were making a pragmatic choice for stability. But siding with the military against the working class wasn't pragmatism. It was a fundamental betrayal that unleashed forces they couldn't control, leading not just to the failure of socialism, but eventually to the destruction of their own republic and the catastrophe of Nazism.
A stark reminder of Rosa Luxemburg's warning. An incredible and sobering deep dive. Thank you for walking us through that. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. See you on next episode, comrades. Bye-bye.